Welcome to A Course in Miracles, where you'll discover health and well-being through inner peace. Your host is Eloisa Ramos, EFT master and author of Beyond Self-Esteem, Discovering Your Boundless Self-Worth. Using EFT, the Ramos clearing technique, and the principles of A Course in Miracles, you'll learn how to open your mind to healing and to all that is inherently yours: deep fulfillment, vitality, joy, and inner peace.
Welcome to our program for today, The Last Judgment, Perceptions End, and Mind Awakens with A Course in Miracles. My name is Eloisa Ramos, and I'm very happy to be with you, exploring the ideas in A Course in Miracles. Our intention for today's program is to bring clarity to our mind around the questions of: what is the last judgment? Is God's judgment like our own that appears to condemn, or does it set us free from all error in perception, awakening the mind from its dream of separation to truth? We also want to open our minds to the guidance in lessons 311 to 320 so that we may accept God's last judgment and our return to truth. So before we get into what is the last judgment, I want to begin by looking at what happens in our ego mind when we judge and what function it serves. Lesson 311 says, quote, "I judge all things as I would have them be." Judgment was made to be a weapon used against the truth. It separates what it is being used against and sets it off as if it were a thing apart, and then makes of it what you would have it be. Unquote. I'm going to use some examples to illustrate this. One morning, I was thinking about sending a text to a wonderful client of mine to remind him to pay the outstanding balance on his account. I was judging the amount he owed as insignificant for him, yet I noticed a little bit of embarrassment in having to send him a reminder text again, since I had already sent him an invoice and texted him before. I decided to investigate this feeling of embarrassment and asked, who is feeling embarrassed? In other words, what is holding this embarrassment within me? I recognized it was not my true self, but ego. Still, I wanted to see the underlying thought that was the root of the embarrassment. So, I tuned into the feeling of embarrassment while I tapped. And what I saw was that it came from a comparison and judgment my mind was making. I was comparing myself to my client, and the judgment I was making was, I am less than him. When I looked deeper into this comparison and judgment, I saw what my ego mind had done in this process of comparing and judging. One, it had separated what I was from what my client was by making us different and unequal. My perception could then distinguish between more than and less than, and the judgment became possible. Two, in order to have this judgment appear true, my ego mind had to make up a self-image or a false self of what I was and what my client was. In this case, my mind saw me and identified me with my financial resources. The I in the I am less than him conclusion was really my financial status is less than his. What was being compared was not our true self, which is one and cannot be compared, but our financial resources. And yes, you could say that mine are less than his, but this would be just a fact, and it would say nothing about what we are. Facts do not have judgment tied to them, and so they do not separate. What caused the perception of separation and was an attempt to attack truth or oneness was my belief, which said having different financial resources can make us different and unequal. With this belief, I can compare and judge our financial standing and believe that it has the power to change what we are and how our source created us. Further believing that the truth of what I am can be changed and made into anything I wish. This is a belief in magic, similar to the magic we find in fairy tales and the stories of Harry Potter, where waving a magic wand turns someone or something into something else. So, if I wave my magic wand of judgment and make my identity my financial resources, imagining that's what I am, I can believe I am something that can be changed into something else I wish to be. What is happening, of course, is that I am only comparing financial statuses. But because of the identification, my ego mind will not see the error it is making in substituting my finances for what I am, and will then believe its ego judgment that says, I am less than him. What can see this error in our ego mind is the Holy Spirit, which is also within our mind, so that it can correct it. It is not seeing it to judge it. Believing my ego judgments makes our false self-identities real, but only to our ego mind. So, what happened with me is I lost awareness of my true self-identity because my mind, through comparison and judgment, made a false image of myself, with a capital S, which my ego mind identified with. Now, my ego mind can continue to delude itself, believing it has the power to change what I am and what my client is. In its delusion, my ego mind proclaims itself the creator of me, imagining it has usurped the throne of God with the power to change me into something else like my financial resources. What I want to point out is that suffering, and in my case, embarrassment, and I also found a little bit of shame, results from and is the effect of these judgmental thoughts. But we can also see here that what suffered was not the true self, but rather the false self-image made by my ego mind, since it was this false self, comprised of my financial status, that fell short in the comparison with my client's financial status, and so was judged less than. It was this false self that felt the shame and embarrassment of being less than. My ego mind's judgments only apply to the false self it makes, and so cannot hurt anyone else in reality. All pain and suffering happens at the level of illusion. My ego mind can only hurt itself, but if we are identified with our ego, we will believe we are the ones suffering, and we will experience it that way. Later that day, the thought to send a reminder text to my client showed up again. There was no embarrassment this time, but there was some resistance to doing it. I did not want to do it, and I did not know why. Again, I tuned into the unwillingness I felt and found another judgment saying, I should not have to remind him again. He should be more responsible. And a feeling of indignation came along with this judgment. Judgment separates, and here the separation happened between what is my responsibility and what is his. What this judgment did was mark out territory, similar to how animals mark their territory with the scent of their urine, and an imaginary fence was drawn in my mind that set apart what belonged to me and what belonged to my client. The issue now was defined as a territorial conflict, and I must have been trespassed or attacked. That was what the feeling of indignation indicated, some type of breach or violation in my territorial boundaries. So, I turned to investigate the feeling of indignation. What is holding this emotion? Well, it's another self-image, a false identification that says, I am a responsible person, and more so than my client. My mind compared my client's behavior with mine and concluded, I should not have to remind him of what is his responsibility to do. That is beneath my status. This false self-identity is also holding that unwillingness or resistance I felt to sending my client the reminder text. It's telling me, how dare you suggest I inconvenience myself and do his work? I have my territory and he has his. If he does not take care of his territory, that makes him irresponsible and less than me. What the ego mind has done is generated an opposing separate will represented by this false self. The irony is that now it appears that not only my opposing wishes or will can contradict God's will, but they can also oppose themselves, which of course makes no sense at all. Because on the one hand, to oppose God's will means my wishes would have to be more powerful than God's. But if they can oppose themselves, then they would be challenging their own power and thereby disempowering themselves. This is basically what internal conflict is. A self that is divided and can oppose itself. But how can this be possible? The ego mind is able to do this because it holds contradictory wishes separate from each other, blocking its own awareness of them together, and so cannot see the contradictions. It splits itself, its conscious awareness, into separate false selves. They hold the contradictory wishes, and so it does not see that it is the author of them both or all. I wanted to send the text, but I also did not want to send the text. And it felt like it was happening at the same time. However, it does not really happen at the same time. My attention is simply going back and forth, switching from one false self to the other. Our mind cannot hold contradictory ideas together. One has to go. That is what correction is. The bringing of illusion to truth, where it simply vanishes or clears and the conflict is released. So, here's what happened next with my client. After releasing the internal conflict, I did not give any thought at all to texting him. And the next morning, he texted me. And he wanted to know if he could pay ahead of time for a couple of sessions for a friend. So I just took this opportunity to remind him of the balance due, and he paid everything right away. So now, what is becoming harder and harder for me to believe is the delusions my ego judgment makes. For it really believes it has replaced God and truth. Not even the contradictions that are brought to light for the ego to acknowledge will necessarily change its mind about what we are. What I mean is, first, in the situation with my client, I was less than, and then I was more than. Clearly, I cannot be both since they are contradictory. But the ego mind believes that I can be both because it hides the truth of my oneness and wholeness from itself. It thinks I am all the different false selves it makes up through judgment. It cannot see through the insanity of this because it splits itself to hold the false identification separately from one another. It holds on to nonsense or darkness which hides the light that can show it the truth. But the light is there and has always been there. This unawareness of the light is called mind asleep. However, A Course in Miracles also tells us that God created mind awake and only awake in truth, and therefore mind cannot really be asleep. The choice the ego mind is making to not see the light or to sleep has no effect on truth. It's like a child closing his eyes and saying, I have turned off the sun. So when we judge, our mind sleeps, taking direction from the ego thought system. It miscreates a dream of separation that hides the truth of its oneness from its conscious awareness. And of course, its conscious awareness is still perception, and so it is still illusion. However, the knowledge of truth is still there in our mind and can be brought to consciousness. We did not lose this knowledge when our mind chose to perceive rather than to know. And we decide to change our mind when we desire to know only truth, and therefore release perception. The Last Judgment gives us grace and the truth we seek, because it solves the one problem of separation, nullifying all questions of identity as completely answered in our ego mind. There is now no more need for perception, for certainty has cleared all subjectivity, and the false self is recognized for what it is, false and illusion. Quote, this is God's final judgment. You are still my holy son, forever innocent, forever loving, and forever loved, as limitless as your Creator, and completely changeless and forever pure. Therefore awaken and return to me. I am your Father, and you are my Son. Page 455, Lessons. The world of perception can only reflect the choice our mind is making to dream or to wake, to fear or to love. I have a long quote here from chapter 18 of the text, The Passing of the Dream, section 2, the basis of the dream. Quote, dreams are perceptual temper tantrums in which you literally scream, I want it thus, and thus it seems to be. People become what you would have them be, and what they do, you order. Dreams show you that you have the power to make a world as you would have it be, and that because you want it, you see it. And while you see it, you do not doubt that it is real. Yet here is a world clearly within your mind that seems to be outside. You do not respond to it as though you made it, nor do you realize that the emotions the dream produces must come from you. You seem to waken and the dream is gone, yet what you fail to recognize is that what caused the dream has not gone with it. Your wish to make another world that is not real remains with you. Your sleeping and waking dreams have different forms, and that is all. Their content is the same. They are your protest against reality, and your fixed and insane idea that you can change it. Unquote. Page 376 text. Here, A Course in Miracles is talking to us as if we are our ego, because most of the time we are identified with a false self that enthrones the ego and makes it real to us. But what it tells us is that the cause of the dream of separation is the wish to make another world that is not real, because it is a protest against reality. It means we have a problem with reality. And this is what our judgment says, because it is fundamentally a resistance that goes against reality. When we don't like the way things are, we judge them. When we don't like the way someone is, we condemn them, not realizing we are only judging and condemning ourselves and causing our own suffering. Our judgment presumes it has the power to oppose reality and how we were created, making a separate will from God's. But of course, it cannot make a separate will. What it does is it distorts or falsifies reality in its own mind, not in truth. Nevertheless, this distortion, or we can call it energy disruption, is the cause of anything that is not perfect peace and joy in our experience. The cause of the dream of separation, with all the fear, suffering, conflict, loneliness, illness, and death it brings, is the wish for reality to be different. Because we have passed judgment on it and condemned it, we perceive it as something that is lacking. There's nothing wrong with reality. It's not lacking or bad in itself. It can only reflect the truth, and that is why God's last judgment does not condemn, but corrects our ego mind. Quote, "You who believed that God's last judgment would condemn the world to hell along with you, accept this holy truth. God's judgment is the gift of the correction He bestowed on all your errors, freeing you from them and all effects they ever seem to have. To fear God's saving grace is but to fear complete release from suffering, return to peace, security, and happiness, and union with your own identity." Unquote. Page 455, Lessons. God's last judgment is our saving grace and gives us complete release from all suffering because it corrects and heals our ego mind, disidentifying us from the ego thought system and establishing our one identity with the sonship. This is where all healing comes from. It is a miracle that God's grace brings that reconnects us to the spiritual truth of our wholeness. Our mind is corrected and healed when it recognizes its reality in its relationship with its source, giving it a new identity, or I should say, restoring the memory of its identity as the one Son of God. This reestablishes direct communication with the source of all life. The mind connects to the God within. And when it recognizes the truth of its one identity. I understand we are very attached to judging, to our judgments, and therefore our ego. We have identified with them, but I want to offer you another example of the detrimental effects of judgment in our experience to give you motivation for letting go of this attachment. Here's my example. As I mentioned before, my husband plays guitar and sings in church, and I help at times when he needs another guitarist. He asked me to help for a funeral mass, and he also needed me to help sing. Here, a self-judgment came up for me that said, I am not a very good singer. I sing crappy. But I tapped and cleared everything I could find around it. We played and sang, and at least 4 or 5 people gave me really positive feedback on the singing afterwards. But the next day, we ran into a relative at the store, and she made a comment after hearing us sing at the funeral. She told my husband, "You sang really good. You should be the only one singing." I appreciate that my husband's voice is pleasing to the ear, but my ego felt excluded by that remark, and I resented her for making it. The interpretation my ego gave her opinion was that only those with special voices should sing publicly, and so I should not be singing at all. My ego judged this restriction or limitation unforgivable because she was imposing her wishes or will over mine into my territory, the choir. Making the choir into property or territory is again a belief in magic, but it serves a purpose. Territory can be incorporated into my body's peripersonal space, as I mentioned in the program on what is the human body. Having incorporated the choir into my ego body identity made her remark a personal violation that my ego mind could judge unforgivable. I, ego body, could now feel completely justified in defending myself with resentment and condemnation. How dare she exclude me? When I started clearing the resentment I felt, I also wondered why this experience had showed up for me, since I had previously cleared the idea that I sang crappy. What came to me was, from Lesson 312, quote, I see all things as I would have them be. Perception follows judgment, unquote. So, to apply this, what I did is I asked, okay, what did I see here? What was my experience? Well, I felt judged, like I had been told, Eloisa, you have no right to sing in the choir because you do not sing beautifully. Okay, but if I take responsibility for this experience and perception, it means that I am doing it to myself. And if perception follows judgment, it must be a judgment I made that condemns me now. Never mind the family member that made the comment. It was my interpretation of the comment that resulted in my suffering. In fact, she did correct herself and said that she didn't mean anything by her comment in terms of the comparison. So, since I'm doing it to myself, I asked, when did I make this judgment about myself or someone else? And sure enough, the memory came. I was standing in church listening to another choir sing, and I judged a couple of them unfit to sing. The point is that judgments that we make and don't release come back and basically show up in our experience, because perception follows judgment, and we will be judged in the same way. Not because others are really condemning us, but because we will interpret their comments in accordance to our judgment and will condemn ourselves. The good news is that what judgment has made can all be undone because it's illusion. By accepting God's last judgment, we let go of our own judgment and bring salvation to the world of false perception. God's last judgment is the undoing of the ego thought system and therefore of all its effects. There's just one more very important point about judgment I want to make, because it keeps us stuck in lack, limitation, and survival. It does not matter the type of limitation we experience. It could be a lack of money, it could be a lack of health, it could be a lack of a loving relationship. Maybe we feel limited in experiencing joy or in holding inner peace, etc. It's all coming from the same place and keeps us from experiencing what is inherently ours: health, joy, vitality, well-being, and inner peace. I will illustrate this point with a continuation of the example I used before. In comparing my singing voice with my husband's and concluding, I sing crappy, I accepted and believed this judgment. I gave authority and reality to the part of my mind that is making these judgments, the ego. The ego thought system includes all of our past learning, which we use in order to be able to evaluate. In this example, I had identified myself with my singing a made-a-false self that could be compared and judged. So my ego mind believed it had changed me and so created me. But in order to hold on to the illusion of ego and its perceived power, my mind has to deny the truth of its unlimited nature. My mind has to keep making up false limited selves to identify with. It has to make itself small, powerless, and a fragile victim. It has to keep defending and attacking because it can never be completely safe. It will always be vulnerable to something. It has to live in fear. So here's the catch. We cannot hold on to the illusion that the ego in its power is real without having to continually embrace false self-identities that make us limited, and we will have to endure struggle, attack, experience fear and death, and continue to experience survival challenges. In my example, I will have to try and do my best to make sure that I sing crappy if I want to keep the ego enthroned and my false self real in my mind. I will need to work against my own best interests. How insane is that? There is a disincentive in doing what is truly in my best interest here, because if I sing well, I will make my ego wrong and begin to release my loyalty and protection of it. We always come back to the same choice: limitation or freedom, fear or love, the grievance or the miracle, the ego or our healing. They are irreconcilable and bring us to the experience of either hell or heaven. Why would any mind choose hell over heaven? No mind in its right mind would make such a choice. Yet, while we still believe we have a separate will, and that a separate will is possible apart from God's, we will believe that is the choice before us. But can there really be a choice between nothing and everything? Only one option is real. And when the mind recognizes that reality offers us everything, and that that's what is real, it will have accepted the last judgment, which can only belong to God, because there is only one will, His will, in which we share. I would like to conclude with this quote from page 455 of the lessons. But before I do that, let me just clarify the point I made a little bit before. The option between illusion and reality is not really a choice, because illusion is illusion. It has nothing to do with truth and what we are. Here's the quote. God's final judgment is as merciful as every step in His appointed plan to bless His Son and call Him to return to the eternal peace He shares with Him. Be not afraid of love, for it alone can heal all sorrow, wipe away all tears, and gently waken from his dream of pain the son whom God acknowledges as his. Be not afraid of this. Salvation asks, you give it welcome, and the world awaits your glad acceptance, which will set it free. Unquote. Page 455, Lessons. Thank you for listening. Many blessings, joy, and peace in your celebration of Christmas. Until next time, when we explore the question, what is creation? Blessings, everyone.
For more information about EFT, muscle testing, working with Eloisa, and to download a free version of the Ramos Clearing Technique, visit www.healingwitheft.com.